Minds are one. Our thoughts are one. Okay, we're live. Excellent. Hello. Class is about to start. I don't know. All right, shall we begin? Shh. I love that sense of power. That's great. Okay, I am mic'd heavily. Excellent. Hey, internet people, you're back online, and can you see the screen? People online? Excellent. All right, so today's topic is a fun one. The thing that everyone thinks they know about, experiments. Now, before that, you notice that I've uploaded the list of poster groups, and a couple people aren't on the list, and they've emailed me already. If you haven't emailed me, do so quickly, so that I know that I missed your group. So it's on the website. It's important that we have the names of all the groups so that we have space reserved for you on April 5th. Also, on March 20th, not this week, that's next week Thursday, I will not be here, but the class will still go on. It'll be online as this experiment continues. And the university probably isn't thrilled that I'm not here physically, so I'm not doing it probably once and without telling anybody. So I won't be here physically. The room will still be available to you. You can still come here and bring your computers, but you don't have to be, obviously. You can watch from home or wherever. But I will attempt to broadcast live from wherever I happen to be on that day. So where do you access the video? As currently, you can do it on my YouTube channel, which is that. You can go to my website and click on video. You can go to Google Plus and add me as a circle contact thing, and it'll pop up. Or you can go to the lecture video section of the website, and hopefully by then I will have already created the link. You can access it there. If you haven't been doing so already, that's where the links will be. Now, currently, it crashes a lot, right? So if you're watching and it crashes, stay tuned. I'll reinitiate it and see what happens. It shouldn't crash on the 20th because I'll be using a different computer. It's my Chromebook that's causing all the crashage. Now, I think that I'm going to accept questions on the 20th via Twitter, just to be fun. Just to make Twitter useful for once, right? So which means it'll be an entirely live event. The lecture will be live to the world. The tweets will be live to the world. Not that anybody actually watches, but theoretically it'll be live. And also, if you don't want to watch live, that's your problem. You can just watch the recorded version later. Right? Excellent. Any questions on a live lecture via YouTube on the 20th? Isn't that exciting? And I'll wear pants, I promise. As far as you know. Okay. The other thing is that if you haven't received an email from the university yet, you will. This class is part of an experiment they're doing, ironic because today's topic is experiments, on doing the class evaluation online. So instead of bringing in a stack of things to fill out, you'll be sent a link, and you can visit that link at any time you want between the 17th onward to fill out the class evaluation. However, I am still required to give you class time to do it anyway, and I haven't decided what day that will be. It'll probably be on the Tuesday after the 20th. What's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 25th. So on that day, I'll ask you to bring your laptops in if you haven't done already, and if you haven't done your evaluation, then do it by that point. Right? Any question about the evaluation? I can't believe it took them this long to do it online. It's so obvious that it has to be done online, right? But you can't, like, usually people draw pictures for me and stuff. You can't do that online, so I'm going to miss out on the pictures. All right. So we will begin with the scientific process. Everyone thinks they understand the scientific process, right? Have you taught about the scientific process? Never? Really? No? Is that something we actually cover in this program, the scientific method, the scientific process? Really? Where do we cover that? What class? Okay, that's good. So depending on which professor you get, you may or may not cover it. And the research method process thing isn't an absolute. It has a historical precedent. It comes out of the Greek Ionian tradition, and it's not carved in stone anywhere. and it's actually not as methodological and as machinistic as you might think. A lot of philosophical work has been done on the qualitative aspects of the scientific process. It begins with an observation of something. Newton watches the apple fall, and he has an hypothesis about, well, perhaps all things are falling. Perhaps the moon is falling. Perhaps there's a force bringing this down. And he arranges an experiment, and he conducts data from this experiment and makes a conclusion, and then extrapolates the results of this experiment to the entire universe. The problem there is that everything in between the observation and the extrapolation are mechanistic. There's a machine, you just crank it out, create an experiment, collect data, analyze data. The endpoints are very qualitative. How did he have the incredible insight to perceive the apple dropping was indicative of a larger force? How does he have the additional insight to extrapolate from his results to some grander meaning in the universe? These are poetic constructs. So even though I'm presenting to you a series of mechanistic steps, there is a strong humanistic element to this, of creativity and insight. And if there wasn't, they wouldn't need scientists. We'd have computers and robots to do all this, even though many science students kind of are a little robotic. So our thing begins with an idea or an observation. For example, all the pygmies with doofus disease I've ever met were left-handed. Right? And I have met some pygmies, by the way. They're excellent people. But they weren't left-handed and didn't have doofus disease. But let's say I've made that observation. From there, the insight, the grand poetic conflagration and extrapolation that I perceive from this observation leads me to an hypothesis that maybe left-handed pygmies are more likely to have doofus disease. That's hypothesis mark test, right? And that leads me to a research question, which is, what is the prevalence of doofus disease among left and right-handed pygmies in the valley of Dionandi, etc.? Now, to answer this question, I need a data source, and I found one here, the patient records from the 3 main doofus disease clinics, right? And I have a design. Let's say I'm going to use a cross-sectional cohort design, which doesn't exist. What the hell is that? I made up that term. Yeah. You see that, right? You see that it's made up. Everyone got that. Everyone thought it was real. Good. Okay. And then I have a project. See? So that is typically how one hopes that the epidemiological process evolves. It doesn't always. But we think of that sequence of approaches. And for your poster, again, you may have a similar sequential approach. A question, a process, a data source, a result. So the statement of a research question is very important. I know you've covered this in research methods, and we've covered over the PICO bits as well, but it's separate from an hypothesis. And different people have different takes on what the difference between a research question and an hypothesis are. And unfortunately, I probably have a take on it that's different from another professor. But in general, my take is this. An hypothesis is something that is measurable, testable. A research question is a thing you're trying to answer. So you've got a topic, a question, and a hypothesis. The topic is broad. The question is specific, and hypothesis is testable. And this is what you perform statistics on, and this is what you answer at the end of the day. So on April 5th, when you present your project, you'll have a broad topic. I think someone is doing something on marijuana and depression. Yeah, it's always one every year, something on marijuana and something else. Right? So that's your broad topic. The relationship between marijuana and depression. The question, does smoking marijuana lead to depression later in life? An hypothesis. Amongst young males in Canada aged 14 to 17, does smoking marijuana once per week over a 1-year period lead to a measurable increase in clinically diagnosed depression within the next 5 years? Okay. The last bit is a testable question, but we're actually answering the second bit. So clear? Okay, that's where you perform steps. Answer this and discuss that. So again, this is the mechanistic aspect of it. At the end of the day, this is what you bring back to society, something to discuss, a large topic. Here's an example. Research topic, physical activity and cardiovascular disease. The problem, is there a link between lack of physical activity and hypertension? The question, will 30 minutes of moderate activity reduce hypertension? And the hypothesis is even more specific than that. Obviously, this example was taken from Australia, because we don't care about Queensland otherwise. Okay. And this portion here is what we build into our methods section. So everything leading up to here is kind of the introduction of a paper, and this is where the methods begins and then continues on. In your poster, you may have a separate section entirely on a research question. That's advisable, probably, to really specify what you're trying to explore. You may or may not have an hypothesis because your methodology is simply a literature review. And so it's not as rigorous or as intense as a statistical approach might be. So it may not need a hypothesis. But if you want to add one, you're welcome to do so. Okay. So an example from your poster, what happened there? Your topic might be autism and diet. Your question might be, is eating cheese within the first few years of life associated with having autism amongst Ontario boys? Method, literature review, using these keywords. The results, you found 15 studies, 7 had a positive association, 5 found no association. And your conclusions is that there's some evidence for some association, blah, 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 blah. That's a skeletal outline of your poster presentation. Obviously, what you're going to do on the day is a lot more detailed than that. But that's kind of the flow. Cool. So those are examples from the scientific method and how it applies to your poster presentation. I'm going to move on now, unless you have any questions or comments about that little short diversion. Excellent. So silent today, so quiet and serious. What's going on? Wow. All right, a little scared. So today we are talking about experiments, in particular clinical trials. How do we define an experiment again, separate from an observational study? What is the defining characteristic of an experiment? Yes, sir.
It requires physical manipulation
of some, excellent. So some kind of manipulation of the variables. So the investigator is doing something. Usually the investigator is introducing an element to differentiate one group from another. So here's a joke. The police call, we're taking out of the clinical trial and putting in the criminal trial. So here is my flow chart again. We're not in this universe. That's a whole different paradigm. We've covered observational studies, and we're down here. We are into the meat of what the layperson believes science is all about, the interventional studies. But by now, I hope you realize that most of what we know about health actually comes from here. But this stuff is really expensive, really intrusive, and very rarefied, I hope you will discover today, and maybe not as generalizable as we think. But this is where most of it seems to come from. And yet, in the hierarchy of evidence, in the pyramid of evidence, we put the experiment pretty high up, especially the RCT, the randomized controlled trial. Right? Above that is systematic review. And yet most of our evidence comes from here, but the best quality is up here. And again, as I'm fond of saying, most decision-making is based on what's down here. Interesting. So, going back to our basics again, we need a null hypothesis. What's the null hypothesis again in statistics? Remember that? This is a Gomez slide, by the way, so I won't go into too much detail. Yes.
There's no relationship between.
There's no relationship between the things being measured. Or the two groups are equal. Yes, ma'am. Trying to prove.
Well, you're trying to go towards it in terms of.
You're testing it. I think you're testing. I want to shy away from words like prove, if possible. Right? So you're testing to see whether or not your evidence leads you to accept the null or fail to reject, or fail to accept, or reject the null or fail to reject the null. Okay? Do we ever say accept the null?
No.
Why not?
Because you're not trying to.
Why do we never say we accept the null? Yes.
Because you're saying that you don't know for sure that no relationship exists, but you don't know if a relationship does exist?
Precisely. All we have is insufficient evidence for accepting it. For rejecting it, rather. Whew. It's complicated, isn't it? So the best way to think about it is like a criminal trial. So if you're accused of murder one day, I'll deny ever knowing you. But if you're accused of murder one day and you go to trial, then the jury is instructed to either issue a verdict of guilty or not guilty. Not guilty or innocent, but guilty or not guilty. Because innocent is a positivist approach. It is saying that there is overwhelming evidence that in fact you did not commit the crime. Whereas the barrier to rejection is that there's insufficient evidence to convict you, therefore we won't convict you. You still might have done it. We're not saying you didn't do it. We think you might have done it actually, but we haven't gotten enough to convict you. Same logic applies here. We haven't gotten enough evidence to reject the null, so we'll fail to reject it. We're not saying it's scot-free. All right, off a tangent there. So this slide is kind of irrelevant. I don't know why it's there, but here's the terminology again. The symbols used. So the null hypothesis is the H sub O. Pi is a proportion usually. So it's saying that this measurement from this group is equal to the measurement from that group. That's what we're testing as a null. Okay, randomized trials are the best kind of trials, the trials that we think we always want. They're a kind of study design that we use to evaluate new interventions, new approaches. We think about them as tests for drugs usually because most of the RCTs done around the world are done by drug companies on drugs, but they don't have to be. We can run RCTs on anything. That's an intervention. I've seen them run on classroom strategies using this new way of teaching. We'll randomize these classes and some of them will get this kind of teaching and others won't. Right? Or we can do it on psychotherapy interventions, or we can do it on different kinds of clothing to see if they make you feel better or not. These have all been done. So any kind of intervention is possible. We use the drug example because it's convenient and it makes sense to us. And it's very often done. So here I got a list of where they're applied. RCTs can be used to evaluate drugs and therapies, programs for screening, a number of things. These are health examples, but they don't have to be. So the steps of a randomized trial is first to have your population identified. Then you randomize between your groups. The groups are called arms, study arms. So some will receive the thing that you're testing, others will not. In classical RCT design, we have two arms. You can have multiple arms. Test multiple things at once. And there are different kinds of control groups. In general, there are three kinds of control groups. The first is the obvious kind, the kind that does not receive treatment. So let's say you're testing a new migraine drug. So your treatment arm gets the drug. In the first example, the control group gets nothing. Or we can say the control group gets the existing preferred migraine treatment, ibuprofen. Right? Why would you do that? Why would you have someone give current treatment rather than nothing? Yes.
The drug that you're testing is better than what exists on the market.
To see if the drug you're testing is better than what exists on the market is an excellent reason. Is another reason? Yes. Ethical reasons, right. So if it's a life-saving drug, then what you're essentially saying is my test group, their lives will be saved if my drug works. And I think my drug works, otherwise why would I be testing it? Okay, so I'm saying I want you to live and you not to live. And the way around that is to say that the control group gets the other accepted treatment, so that ethically I'm giving them something that I expect to work as well. But Danielle is correct, though. At the end of the day, what we care about is, does your new thing work better than what's also on the market? Because we're looking for incremental improvements. And lastly, another treatment entirely. We could compare one arm to another arm, two different kinds of treatments that we're comparing. That's, in my experience, that is not as typical, but it's possible. Okay, and then we compare the groups for their outcomes. So that's how it looks graphically. Study population, we randomize. One gets treatment, the other gets a placebo. We'll talk about that is later on. Now that looks a lot like a cohort design, does it not? We're following a group through time, and to see one group will be exposed and they won't, and we follow through to see the outcome. What makes it not a cohort study? Yes?
Because people don't choose their groups by themselves. They're put into the
Exactly. People did not choose which group they're in. We put them in. We as the investigators put them in this group based upon our randomization process. Okay. Why do we randomize? I know we've covered all this before, but these are important concepts, so I'll make sure you understand. Why do we randomize? Yeah.
Give everyone equal opportunity towards getting intervention, and also to be able to generalize what we have gotten from sample population
You're dancing around it. There's something a little more profound here. Someone other than you for a change. You, Mr. Fellis.
Minimize.
I feel so professorial when I say that. You, Mr. Fellis, what is your insight you wish to share with us this afternoon? Please, enlighten us with your insights.
Too nervous. I was gonna say minimize selection bias.
Minimize selection bias. Yes, yes, but how is that happening?
Well, the investigator has no control over which person
Right.
goes into which.
So, example I gave earlier in the semester was if it's a migraine drug again, there are things we know that may affect how the drug responds. There may be issues around gender. Maybe women respond differently than men. Maybe women are more likely to get migraines than men. So we want to make sure that there's an equal number of women in men in each group. But the critical part here is that there's some things we don't know that may be differential here. There are characteristics that we haven't identified yet that may be potential confounders or factors that influence the outcome. And randomization allows us to theoretically create an equal distribution of those unknown factors. If I know the factors are problematic, like gender, then I can force an equal distribution of women and men in both groups. If I know that age is going to be an issue, then I can force an equal distribution of age, or just choose one age to look at. It's the stuff I don't know that's problematic. And that's really the power of the randomization process. In theory, it allows us to equally distribute factors that even we haven't identified. Okay, so then there's this thing called blinding. So blinding is when you don't know who got what. So why do we blind? Yes.
To ensure objectivity.
Objectivity.
So you don't have the researchers like after being subjective to.
Okay, I think you know what you're talking about. Let me back up a bit and say that there are two kinds of blinding, right? There's single blinding, which is just when the people getting the drug don't know if they got the drug. And there's double blinding, when the people don't know which drug they got, and the researchers don't know which drug they were given. So, having said that, why are we blinding again? Matt, do you have a...
I was going to say for the patient side, I mean, it helps avoid the placebo effect.
Okay, placebo effect. Interesting. Yes. Mr. Fellis, enlighten us with your insights. I'll stop. Sorry.
I would say use it if you want to use a placebo, because if nobody knows what they're getting, then the placebo effect, the placebo can be used. But if nobody's blinded, then the placebo is kind of useless. So you blind to see whether the effect you're seeing is due to the belief that it's working.
Okay, so it's the same thing that Mr. Scott just gave us. So I love knowing people's last names. Powerful. It's great. Right, so you're on the same page, and we'll go discuss this a bit further in a second. But that's essentially why, is we're trying to avoid the tendency for people to respond simply by knowing that they have a drug.
And I would say also like the double blinding would be for like a kind of interviewer bias, where like if the interviewer doesn't know which intervention you have, they can't like bias their results stories.
Right, a kind of interviewer bias. Right, and there are actually two specific kinds of biases we're going to talk about in a second that are specific to the randomized controlled trials that spring from interviewer bias. Very good. Bit ahead of me. Okay, so that's the design again. We have a population. Let's say it's migraine sufferers. Okay, a group will get the new drug. A group will get the old drug, ibuprofen versus our miracle drug, and we'll see which ones have fewer migraines. These two groups. Okay. So there, it's considered to be the gold standard of causation. Right. So now we can be pretty much assured that if you have a lesser rate of migraine sufferage, it's probably due to my new drug, because we've controlled the extraneous variables as much as humanly possible. So to the best of our abilities, we're ascertaining causation here. Right? So the advantages are are extra variables are well controlled. What extra variables? Well, if you're in a clinical environment, especially in a hospital, I can control what food you're eating, I can control who you're talking to, I can control, if you look for migraines again, how much light you're getting, all these other factors, and remove them from my analysis. Okay. Temporal relationship is well established. So again, I can control, I'll make sure that you got the drug first before getting a migraine, so I know one didn't come before the other. And if it's blinded, then it's pretty solid in general. Right? Disadvantages: enormously expensive. In the example I just gave you, in the scenario I just gave you, you have a bunch of people living in a hospital for a couple months there. That's pretty expensive. Paying for the drugs themselves is pretty expensive. And it doesn't represent the real world. What does that mean? What do I mean by that? It doesn't represent the real world. I know Danielle wants to say something, but she feels shy. Instead,
is it that the exposure is a naturalistic compared to cohort and case control?
Naturalistic, what does that mean?
In the sense that, trying to find the right words.
Struggle, Mr. Ratti. Share with us your insights, please. We wait with bated breath.
Because you're intervening and providing the intervention as opposed to it occurring.
Sort of. You're on the right track there. Is that a hand back there? That's what it comes down to. And the real world isn't control. The real world, you're walking around, you're exposed to all kinds of stuff. You're talking to people, you're hanging out, you're eating different kinds of foods, etc. Okay? So, and ultimately, when the drug goes wild, it will be in the real world. So, how valid, word valid again, validity, is our process for generalizing to the real world. Now, this has great import when we talk about non-Western medicine, as I hope to later on today. Right? Because one of the criticisms of this process, it is not relevant to Eastern medicine and ethics. And this is more about one of the questions on the midterm, really, or I think around your assignment, is sometimes it's not ethical to conduct certain randomized trials. Right? It's not ethical to make a bunch of kids smoke for 20 years and see which ones get lung cancer. So problems there. Okay, random assignment, random allocation is important. So the beauty of random assignment is that each participant has an equal chance of being in any group. In the good old days, it would be done literally in a coin flip process. First name on my recruitment list, flip a coin. That group, flip a coin, that group, that group. Or we actually used to have books of random numbers before computers were prevalent. You get that? Actually books of random numbers. And what you do is like you'd roll the dice and say, page 6, line 4, column 5, number 12. Okay, and you give that person, seriously, that's what was done. You make things as random as possible. It was pretty hard. So it doesn't presume that each person is the same. It just presumes that on average, the characteristics will be equally distributed. But randomization doesn't guarantee equivalence. Equivalence is about balance in numbers. So let's say I have a lineup of people, all of whom have been accepted into my study. I must now choose which ones get into group A, which ones get into group B. So flip a coin. Daniela comes to me, flip a coin. I get heads, you're over there. Alana comes, I flip a coin for Lenny, and I get group B. And then fellows over here, fellows over here, and I keep on going down the road, and there's no guarantee that I'm going, if I have 20 people coming at me, I'm going to have 10 here and 10 there. I can get 15 here and 5 there, or 19 here and 1 there. Because, as you learn from stats class, if I can flip 20 heads in a row, what's the probability the next one will be a tails? 50-50, because these are independent events. It's entirely possible that I can have incredible imbalance in my two groups if I randomize in that fashion. So the science of randomization becomes another subcategory of epidemiology, of deciding, figuring out ways of randomizing such that I'm guaranteed equivalent balance in sizes. The guy that's frowning at me. All right? Okay, good. Excellent. So, we're going to go through in next class methods of randomization in a bit more detail. So, sometimes in a randomized controlled trial, people will change groups partway. How would they change group? That's a weird thing to do, right? Sometimes they change group for a variety of reasons. Do you know of any reasons? Any reason, Kaya, why they change groups?
There is a study design which is cross-sectional, so after a while they change both groups to affirm more the effect of the intervention.
He's an expert in RCTs, so I refer to him for all the hard questions. That's correct. Right. So if you're changing groups, there are different ways of analyzing it. Now, sometimes as well, they change groups because we break a seal and figure out which group you're in the first case, and we figure out you're not responding the right way, we'll put you in that group. There's some weird things that go down. If we analyze you according to the group you ended up in, there's a term for that. That is called the on-protocol analysis or the per-protocol analysis. Okay, so in other words, we analyze you based on the protocol that you received. Maybe you started out in the drug group and you ended up in the placebo group. We're going to pretend that you were always in the placebo group. Now, maybe you started out in the placebo group and you ended up in the treatment group. We're going to pretend you're always in the treatment group. That's called the per-protocol analysis. On the other hand, we could treat you as if you were always in that group. Sorry, you never left that group. So the group you started out with is the one you stay in. So if you started out in the treatment group and you moved to the placebo, we're still going to treat you as if you're still in the treatment group. With me? That's called the intent to treat methodology. So it's where you ended up in the first place. Even though you received the other drug, we're going to pretend that you're in that first one. We think that this is superior. And the saying is, if you randomize, you analyze. What? Analyze, not analyze. Come on. Come on. It's one of those days. Why is this superior, you think? Or preferred? It's a tough call. Yes.
Would it be because you're down, I forget the word, like down estimating the
Effect size?
Yeah.
Okay, you're being conservative.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a conservative approach is usually preferred. Also, philosophically, it can be argued that your process of crossing over was part of your journey through this menagerie of treatment. And therefore, yes?
Oh, okay.
You stretching?
Yeah, no, yes.
Yes, okay.
I don't fully understand this because if someone starts in the placebo group, they switch over to the treatment group, and you treat them as if they're in the placebo group, wouldn't that taint your results?
Yeah, it taints, but it taints it towards a null hypothesis. So, in other words, it's conservative, as Mr. Fellows was saying. It's if you're going to err towards the null, so that the threshold for finding an effect is higher to get through. All right. On the other hand, if they switched over, then it's kind of as if they've gotten two experiences and they're more likely to respond, and you're biasing it away from the null. That would be the statistical reasoning. The philosophical reasoning is that that was their path at the point they entered. Now we Now, all right, so part 2 of the experiment thing. So as I mentioned, here are different kinds of randomization, and there are different ways of concealing the allocation that you're in. So let's talk about blinding again. Remember that there are 2 kinds of blinding. There's single blinding and double blinding. Single blinding is when just the participants don't know what group they're in, and double blinding is when neither participants nor the researcher knows what group they're in. So there are all kinds of biases possible in randomized controlled trials. We've already heard about kinds of investigator bias. There are 2 that I want to talk about: the Hawthorne effect and the Rosenthal effect. You've heard these before in research methods, yes? Okay. All right. So I'll go over them again. You've heard of Hawthorne, not Rosenthal. Good, something new. So Hawthorne is a tendency for people to try harder because they're being watched. Do you know the history of this? It's named after the Hawthorne Works, which is a factory. And they decided to run an experiment or investigation to see if changing the light levels in the factory would affect worker productivity. And they found a couple things. They found that if you had more light, then the workers did work more. But really, as long as the experiment was undergoing, the workers worked more. And that got people thinking, simply being watched makes you work harder. So what's the relevance of that to an RCT, do you think? Simply being watched makes you behave differently, makes you work harder, makes you do something. That hand, yes?
If you're waiting for them to recover from a cold, they might do other health behaviors they wouldn't usually because they're studying.
Yes, that's one, absolutely, yes. So people are behaving a different way, and?
I was going to say diet ones, like if you have to keep track of what you're eating every day, you're going to be good.
Yes, that's good too, and?
The effects that you're seeing is not due to the intervention, but it's due to simply the knowledge that they're being watched.
Yeah, it's almost quantum mechanical, wherein the observer is having an effect on the outcome. So there's this weird thing where if people know that they're being studied, they behave somewhat differently from if they're not being studied. Now, that can be perceived to be a psychological thing. Maybe it might be physiological as well. Maybe with the fact that I'm studying you, somehow your body responds differently. It's a weird thing, isn't it? But it exists. So, in other words, just because you're in a study, you tend to respond better than if you're not in a study, or at least differently, either through behavior or through physiology. Physiology is more difficult to explain, and maybe it's not true, but definitely behavior has changed if you're being watched in a study. The Rosenthal effect, you've heard of that, right? The Rosenthal effect is just when the experimenter affects the experiment. Usually it's done through giving unintentional cues. So it's also called the Pygmalion effect. Have you ever heard of Pygmalion, the Greek myth of Pygmalion? Well, if you haven't, look it up. It's also a musical, Pygmalion. So Pygmalion effect is called, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the origin of the Rosenthal effect, historically, is they did a study of schools. And the question was, could teachers invest better in high-performing students to make them even better performing students? What they did, though, was they randomly chose students and told the teachers, these are actually high-performing students. Right. And by knowing that the students are high-performing, the teachers actually start perceiving them as being high-performing, even though they weren't. So some strange thing there. Where, again, both of these situations are situations where the experimenter was affecting the outcome simply by knowing. Right. So in the second case, the Rosenthal effect, the experimenter is affecting the outcome because they know what's going on. In the first case, the experimenter is affecting the outcome because the participants are aware they're being watched. So blinding, in theory, tries to minimize those two effects. Single blinding tries to minimize the Hawthorne effect, and double blinding tries to minimize the Rosenthal effect. Cool. Right on. Right. Let's talk a bit about placebo. You've all heard of this before. Placebo means I please in Latin. Okay, the term goes back a long way, and it has a tension with Hippocratic Oath. What do you think that tension is? You know the oath talks about, right? The oath talks about I will always strive to do good. I will always try to serve my patient, I'm a doctor, etc. But a placebo is saying, here, take this pill that I know won't do you any good. So if I'm a caregiver, I'm somehow behaving unethically by giving you something that I don't believe is actually going to help you. So there's always some ethical dimension to this that's problematic. So placebo effect, we talked about already. Placebo effect is when people respond because they think the thing is real. And it's a fascinating idea. It is just fascinates me no end. Because let's say again, it's a migraine medication, right? You've got your two study arms. This arm is receiving the drug. This arm is receiving placebo. In most cases, it's a sugar pill, so no clinical content whatsoever, right? They both get better to a certain extent. This one gets better more than this one. And we say the effect size is the difference here, right? Well, what the hell is this? That's pretty amazing that you got nothing, but you still got better. We tend to ignore this. We only focus on this. Look, our drug gave us this much better than placebo, but maybe it got this much better, and that's the effect size. Well, that's amazing. That, you know, you got this much better from nothing. Right? So that's almost magical. And this is not really explored as much as I think it should be. So we call sometimes the physiological effect produced by placebo. Why? Because it's real. It's not just psychological, it's physiological. Your body is responding. And that to me is great. That's incredible. Right? So it's often argued that a big chunk of both Western medicine and maybe a bigger chunk of non-Western medicine is just actualization of placebo effect. And we use those terms as a kind of dismissive, just placebo effect. Don't dismiss it. That's powerful shit, man. Placebo effect. I need more placebo effect. I can get better without taking a pill. That's great. Right? So how relevant is this for alternative therapies? I'm going to talk about homeopathy in a second because that's our favorite ripping boy, homeopathy, because we all agree that's nonsense. But it's interesting as a study area. So it can be argued, you all know what homeopathy is, right? Okay, homeopathy is, it's not an ancient naturopathic science. It goes back to Germany last century, right? It's based on this interesting pseudoscience around the power of the thing that made you ill to make you better. And if you can't get enough of that, then you put it next to some water molecules, and the water molecules magically take on the whatever. Okay, I don't mean to degrade homeopathy, but it is nonsense. Right? And but people sometimes do get better from it. And if they do get better from it, is that not a good thing? So the scientists will say that the effect of homeopathy, when it does make you better, because homeopathy makes you slightly better than placebo. So what is that? A guy has a theory about that. What's going on there, Guy?
The belief of the practitioner affects influence the outcome of the patient.
Right, but if you're double blind the exercise, what happens then? We don't know, right? So the fact that the belief of the practitioner is somehow affecting the patient's mood to get better suggests that the relationship is part of the therapy. So if the relationship is part of the therapy, that is not something you can create a pure, double-blinded, randomized control around. There isn't a single one-time intervention. There's an ongoing relationship. That's the intervention. And if that's the case, then as quacktastic as homeopathy is scientifically, it's still a fairly valid therapy if at the end of the day it does make you better. Right? So part of the problem with assessing non-Western therapies is a lot of non-Western therapies aren't based on a single intervention like a pill or treatment. It's based on a relationship where you must know you're being treated and you must feel comfortable in the arms of your therapist, etc., who's going to walk you through all this. It leverages a great deal of placebo effect. And to disentangle that relationship is to make the entire process fall apart. So it will not satisfy the very harsh requirements of an RCT. Does that make it less valuable? I don't know, but that's the problem before us. So here's a little paper we wrote for BMJ a long time ago on the paradox of the placebo. And here's the issue here, is let's say the RCT is double-blinded, and I'm the researcher. and here are my patients, and I don't know who got what, the placebo or the thing, right? But you start getting better. It was, oh, then hey, you must be. If you're getting better, then I start assuming, well, then you must be in the treatment group, even though I don't know for sure. I'm going to assume that, right? So now, in some ways, blindedness has been dissolved from me because I figured out, he's in the treatment group. Okay, that's the first problem here. But then the accelerated process here is that because I think you're in the treatment group, now the psychological Hawthorne effect may kick in, not Hawthorne effect, Rosenthal effect may kick in, where I'm actually compelling you to get better because I think you're in the treatment group. So it's an accelerated process. That's what makes this feel so exciting, is we're still philosophically debating these little tiny nuances that may create differences in effect size that may throw out the entire house of cards of the experimental science. You get what I'm saying? Kind of, maybe? Getting weird looks. Okay, good. It's fascinating stuff. Okay. So what is the perfect clinical trial? There's a rationale, there's control, there's randomization, there's blindness, etc. Is there sufficient size in our sample? Do we have good inclusion and exclusion criteria? Is it ethical? And have we figured out what your analysis is going to be? And that brings us to how do we determine a good trial from another trial? There are lots of organizations that they give us checklists of what to look for. One of the more popular ones is called the consort statement. I forgot what consort stands for. Remember? Okay. But this is important to know because the consort statement was invented here in Ottawa by David Moore and his group here at CHIO, actually. So, and it's considered now to be one of the standards of assessing the quality of a randomized controlled trial. I don't need you to know the details of the consort statement. Just know that it is a checklist for assessing the quality of a randomized controlled trial. And it includes these issues. This is actually a statement. You have to go through here and look up all these other issues. But it looks at these things. How random was it? Was the rationale put forth reasonable? Was your sample size good? Are your outcome measurements clear? Do you know when to stop? Isn't that amazing? Do you know when to stop? Because sometimes randomized controlled trials, oh, I'll see if the patient gets better. What's better? Have you defined better? Yeah. So stopping was good. Also, do you know when to stop early? At what point are people getting ill such that you must stop this? Okay. So you have to have clear rules for that. Do you have good analysis methods? Do you know anything about your patients? Some people don't. So if I'm running a migraine study, I should know everything about your physiology and your medical background. How often do you get migraines, do you have allergies, et cetera, et cetera. Adverse events and generalizability. Okay. Again, I don't need you to know all this. It's just a description of what consort statement looks like. Another checklist is something called the Haddad score. And the Haddad score is a way of assessing blindedness and randomization. Excuse me. So essentially, these three things. It's was a study randomized? Was the study double-blind? Or at least was it described as double-blind? And was there a description of who was left out? Well, that's kind of cool. That's kind of key. So a lot of these trials, we lose people. So if you're going through this process of taking this experimental drug, you may get sick of it after a couple of weeks. You know, I don't want any parts anymore. I'm leaving the trial. Or I move out of town. Or maybe I stop being eligible. Maybe somebody got pregnant or something and can't take this drug anymore. For whatever reason, people leave the trial. If you leave the trial, suddenly the quality of the individuals that you're studying are going to change. Distribution of those qualities will change. And that may affect the nature of the study, of the outcome. So unless the scientist is reporting on who left and why they left, then it's an incomplete scientific endeavor. Right? Ideally, we want to know the people who left and why they left, what happened to them eventually. Did they die? Did they start getting crazy migraines? Right? These things need to be known. If they're not known, then the study is incomplete, and Haddad will give them a poor score. So based on these criteria, we assess a Haddad score, and that, with the consort statement, is a way of assessing the quality of an RCT. Again, these are two examples of a host of possible quality assessments we can use. Cool. So some of the criticisms here are it's awfully simple and relies too much on blinding, and not everything can be blinded. As I mentioned, if you're assessing an Eastern therapy where the relationship is key, then you can't blind a relationship. Let's say I'm testing, does massage reduce the incidence of migraines over the course of a year? Right? How do I blind you to being massaged? I guess I massage you when you're asleep and you can't tell. That's kind of creepy. So there are a lot of things you can't randomize. So we talked a bit about the Cochrane collaboration. That's a collection of, it's a group that collects randomized trials and systematic reviews. You can look those up as well. They seek to minimize bias, rely heavily on RCTs, and evidence-based medicine is at their heart. So if you're looking for high-quality systematic reviews and RCTs to examine, the Cochrane collaboration is one of the places you can look to. There are other kinds of repositories of systematic reviews and RCTs out there. So here are the philosophy of randomized controlled trials. We have to ask ourselves, what can be randomized? We can't randomize cigarette smoking, for example, ethically. Right? What's a valid placebo? We can't give people a placebo if the alternative is a life-saving drug. That's the obvious thing. When do you break the seal and reveal allocation? Okay, so let's say you're dealing with people who are really, really ill and who need life-saving medication, and you think that you have that medication, and one of your subjects is getting sicker and sicker by the day. Maybe it's time to break the seal to figure out if your medication is making them sicker, or maybe if they should be taken out and given some other medication. So there are compassionate reasons for breaking the seal, other reasons as well. So you need to understand why and when would you stop the blinded process throughout the course of an RCT. Okay. Again, I keep stressing this, but does this logic apply to alternative therapies? And what is the fundamental flaw and the fundamental strength of the RCT? Well, the second one first. What's the fundamental strength of the RCT? Why is it the gold standard? Do you see it? Why do we spend so much time talking about randomized controlled trials and spending money on them? What's so powerful about them? It's in the words, randomized controlled trials. Yes?
Rigor and validity.
Rigor and validity, and that comes out of the fact that they're randomized and controlled. Okay? The fact that I have such intense control over the environment and who's in it and what they're getting is powerful and beautiful. But that's also the fatal flaw. Why is it the fatal flaw? Yes?
Not in real life.
Exactly. It's not as valid as we thought. It's not a real-life scenario. Okay? That's why we also engage in post-market analysis. When the drug goes wild, this happens there as well. Okay. Look at quack. Let's talk more about homeopathy, one of my favorite things. So this is from the British Homeopathic Association. They have this disclaimer on their website. The RCT model of measuring efficacy poses problems for homeopathic research because in homeopathy, a treatment is usually tailored to the individual. Okay. So here is, if you're testing a new treatment for depression, you're looking at, first of all, the kinds of people you recruit for your study, the kinds of people who are relevant. If it's a depression study, you want people who are depressed, but not too depressed because they're going to have other issues associated with them that may confound your results. You want people who are sufficiently depressed, though, that they're going to respond to your drug and not necessarily the placebo. What this means is you're going to get a very small number of people eligible for your study. So this particular example found that 22% of depressed people qualified for a particular RCT, and yet the drug they were testing was later prescribed to all depressed people. That's one of the flaws of the RCT process, is it's so rigorous in its selection endeavor that you end up with a population that may not be representative of that general population you're trying to learn about. Okay. So I mentioned systematic reviews. Remember that systematic reviews contain a variety of studies. The RCTs are the most important study in systematic review. A lot of the best RCTs pretend to have just the best quality RCTs. All right, so let's look at Reiki. Everyone knows what Reiki is, right? Doesn't know what Reiki is. Anybody? You don't know? You know? Who doesn't know? Okay, so Reiki is one of these alternative therapies. It's again, the practitioners will say it's thousands of years old. It's like 50 years old. invented by a Japanese guy in the 50s or 40s who climbed a mountain and had a revelation. His revelation, the disdain in my voice is difficult to hide, but here it is. He climbed a mountain and his revelation was that he could cure people with his touch. Okay, and there are different levels of Reiki. The first level is you cure by touching. The second is you cure from touching the other side of the room, and the third level is you cure from the other side of the world, over the phone or something. Okay, and the way that you graduate through the levels of Reiki is another Reiki practitioner must convey the power upon you after study. So I try anything. I've been treated by Reiki practitioners and fall asleep and stuff. Anyway, let's say you are advising the government or a hospital about whether to fund Reiki, and what do you do with the patient? So here is a study that looked at Reiki. It is a systematic review, and this study was used to justify public funding in Boston being spent on paying nurses to learn Reiki and to give it to patients in Boston hospitals. And yet the conclusion is there's insufficient evidence to suggest that it's effective treatment. Okay. The evidence that was eventually used to compel them to spend money was that patients enjoyed it. They enjoyed spending time with the nurses, etc. Why did I bring this up? I bring this up because it's a systematic review that summarized all of the studies that were done on this. Okay? No effects, no effects, no effects. The statement, though, that the value of Reiki remains unproven is forgiving. It's a conservative statement. It's not accepting the null. It's failing to reject the null. Unfortunately, people see that as a kind of unconscious acceptance. You know what I'm saying? So the phraseology in science is always conservative. Here, we're saying there's no evidence to show that it works. But we're not saying it's fraudulent. We're saying there's no evidence to say that it works. That statement is often being used by those in the political sphere to say there's discontentment in science or disagreement, etc. Another example of this is in climate change stuff. People say, well, there's no evidence that climate change is not affecting the climate. So this reverse kind of terminology there. And so disingenuous politicians say, well, the scientists are saying it's not working. No, it's not what we're saying. I'm confusing you a lot, aren't I? I'm going to move on to the next slide before I confuse you further. Here's a bit of a news article talking about attempted suicide via homeopathic overdose. People have tried to kill themselves with overdose of homeopathic medicines. Homeopathic medicines are just water. Okay, and it's kind of sad or make fun of people, but this person actually tried to kill herself with an overdose of water, like 6 shots of test tubes of water. And every year in England, there's actually a big skeptics protest where they all line up and commit mass homeopathic suicide. So they all take massive overdoses of homeopathic drugs and go watch a movie because nothing happens. Anyway, and then here is actually my massage studio down at Carling. I saw this, I photographed this. Homeopathic first aid classes that are being offered. So there's a video I wanted to show you. Did I show it to you before? Do I have time to show it? It's hilarious. Okay, at the end of the class, it's hilarious. I'll show it to you. This is British comedy on homeopathic ER. I feel so horrible mocking homeopathy because people do believe in it. And, if it works for you, that's great. There's just no evidence for it. And it's the paradigm of epidemiology, of Western medicine, is such that there's no evidence. I don't mean to mock people who practice it and believe in it. It's just that there's no evidence as we define evidence for it. It's interesting, though, that they're teaching homeopathic first aid. Okay, so here are the way that the evidence is communicated. So here is a meta-analysis that was done of clinical trials on the effectiveness of homeopathy, and they found there was nothing going on. 2005, homeopathy had nothing more than placebo effects. 2006, insufficient evidence. 2007, evidence is not sufficient. But if you go to the website, they will say that look at all the studies that have been done on homeopathy. They don't say what the outcomes are, just that a lot of studies have been done. That's disingenuous. Right? So it's okay if you're going to say the RCTs have shown no effect. However, we reject RCTs because of this thing. So you have to be aware of how things are communicated. So the British Homeopathic Society, they'll say that 4 out of 5 major systematic reviews of RCTs on homeopathy have concluded that homeopathy has an effect greater than placebo. Maybe, except the link doesn't actually link anything after 1997 and concludes nothing of the sort. In other words, don't trust the websites or news articles for your science. Read the source evidence yourself and use the skills in epidemiology that you've learned to assess whether these studies are good. And beware of the scientific language. More research is needed. So that that BMJ article, the end with more research needed, isn't saying that we're going to do more research. It just means we got nothing yet. Okay. So what's the bottom line here? RTTs are not perfect. They're flawed, but it's the best we got. Whew, that was a lot of nonsense, wasn't it, today? Sorry about that. I rambled for a bit. So we'll see you Thursday. I won't show the video. I'll post it on the website today. Go ahead. What was it? Oh, I was rambling for a bit there. Stop broadcast, stop.